It was the winter of 1942, when the air itself seemed to carry the weight of despair. Across the English coast, the sky was filled with the low, constant hum of engines returning from missions that had gone wrong. Some never returned at all. The ground crews would stand in silence, eyes searching the horizon long after the night had ended, long after hope had frozen into resignation. In a quiet hangar on the outskirts of Dorset, a single light burned through the fog. Inside, the smell of oil and ozone clung to the air. Wires hung from the ceiling like veins, connecting machines that hummed softly, alive with a cold intelligence, and at the center of it all stood a man thin, quiet, and sleepless. His name was Arthur Hales, an engineer for the Royal Air Force's Radar Research Division. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't wear medals, didn't carry a gun, but he carried something else, the unbearable knowledge that British bombers were being torn from the sky every night. He could hear the casualty lists on the radio, the polite voice announcing death with bureaucratic calm. Each name was a failure, his failure. On the table before him lay a radar display, its green pulse sweeping rhythmically in the dark. Every turn of the line marked another second passing, another reminder of the unseen war, the war of waves and echoes. Arthur leaned closer, his face pale in the glow. Dots flickered and vanished across the screen, each one a reflection of something real, something deadly. He whispered to himself, almost in disbelief. How do you hide a plane from the air itself? It was an impossible question. The German Freya and Würzburg radar systems were terrifyingly precise. They could detect a bomber from miles away, long before the first engine note reached human ears. Every Allied raid was met with a storm of flak. The sky turned into a burning maze of steel and fire. The scientists at the Air Ministry had tried everything: new materials, strange coatings, even wild theories about invisible frequencies. None of it worked. The laws of physics seemed unyielding, the enemy's technology always one step ahead. Arthur ran his hand across the cold metal casing of the radar console. He could feel the faint vibration of the current running through it, like a heartbeat. The machine was alive in its own way, loyal only to the truth of reflection. It could not lie. It could only reveal. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the corrugated roof. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed a familiar warning, almost routine by now. Arthur didn't move. The world outside could burn, and he would still be here, staring at the endless sweep of light, searching for an answer that refused to come. He thought about the pilots, the young ones who joked on the ground, then vanished into the night sky like ghosts. He remembered their laughter, the way they'd say, "You'll find us a way out of this, won't you, Arthur?" He had promised he would, but the truth was, he didn't know how. Weeks had passed without sleep, his notes scrawled across dozens of sheets, equations, signal maps, sketches of impossible devices. Each one ended the same way: failure. Every idea crumbled under the weight of reality. Still, something inside him refused to stop, a quiet defiance, because in his mind there was always the possibility that nature itself held a loophole, that somewhere in the chaos of waves and frequencies there was a trick, a blind spot waiting to be found. He turned off the radar set, and the hum faded into silence. The darkness in the hangar felt heavier now, pressing in. Only the rain kept speaking. Arthur picked up a small object from his desk, a matchbox, old and half empty. He rolled it between his fingers absent-mindedly, the cardboard soft and worn. He didn't know why he'd kept it there, maybe as a distraction, something human among the machines. He struck a match and watched the flame flicker to life. For a moment, it painted his face in orange light, and in that fragile glow, the reflection in his eyes looked like something else entirely, a spark of something yet unnamed. He whispered under his breath, "There's always a way to fool the light." Then the match went out, and the darkness returned. In the quiet that followed, the sound of the rain became steady again, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Arthur leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, and somewhere deep in the labyrinth of his thoughts, an idea began to stir, not yet formed, not yet conscious, but alive. He didn't know it then, but that small flicker, that silent obsession to outsmart the unseen, would soon change the course of the war. The impossible problem. Morning arrived slowly over the Dorset airfield. The fog had not lifted. It never truly did. It rolled in from the channel and settled low, clinging to the hangars and the silent aircraft parked in neat, solemn rows. The ground crew moved like shadows through it, their boots muffled on the damp concrete, their breaths visible in the cold. Inside the research building, Arthur Hales stood before a table cluttered with fragments of metal and glass. The air smelled of coffee gone bitter, of dust and warm circuits. His assistant, a young technician named Reed, entered quietly, holding a stack of printed reports. "Another 10 bombers lost last night," Reed murmured. His voice trembled with exhaustion. "The radar picked them up the moment they crossed the coast. They didn't stand a chance." Arthur didn't look up. He was tracing a finger along the edge of a small copper plate, lost in thought. "They always see us first," he said quietly. "They always see." He turned toward the radar set that dominated the room, a crude but brilliant piece of engineering, all knobs and humming tubes. The screen glowed faintly green in the dim light, a ghostly circle that revealed every movement in the sky, every reflection, every signal. The truth, unkind and absolute. Arthur spoke as though thinking aloud. "If they can see us, we can make them see more than there is. The trick isn't to disappear, it's to make them doubt what they're seeing." Reed frowned. "Sir, we've tried interference. The jammers burn out the circuits before they do anything useful." Arthur nodded absently. "Not interference, confusion." He paused, eyes fixed on the slow, rhythmic sweep of the radar. The sound, that steady, hypnotic pulse, seemed to echo through his mind like a heartbeat. The sound of a system that never slept. He turned away and walked to the window. Outside, the airfield stretched into mist. Men moved about the planes, their figures half swallowed by the fog. Somewhere, an engine coughed to life. Arthur's reflection on the glass looked pale and hollow, the reflection of a man more ghost than flesh. He remembered the first time he'd seen radar work, the magic of it, the invisible made visible. Now, that same brilliance was their undoing. He couldn't escape the irony. The very science that promised safety had become the eye of the enemy. He pressed his hand against the cold window pane and whispered, "If only we could make them see ghosts." The phrase lingered in the air. Reed didn't respond, but he looked up suddenly, sensing that something had shifted in Arthur's tone, something fragile, yet dangerous. Arthur walked back to his desk. The matchbox from the night before still sat there. He picked it up again, turning it over in his hand. The lid caught the morning light and flashed briefly a sharp glint that drew his eye. A reflection. He frowned and tilted it again, watching how the metal strip on its edge caught and threw light at different angles. To anyone else, it was nothing. But to a man obsessed with signals and echoes, it was everything. A reflection could lie. Arthur's mind began to race. He reached for a small radio set on the bench, tuning it to a test frequency. Static filled the air, a wash of noise like ocean surf. He stripped a fresh length of braided copper and rubbed it between his palms until it warmed. The friction woke a memory that had been pacing the corridor of his mind for days. His father in the barn on a January night. Breath hanging like ghosts, an old radio sulking into silence. The man had taken wire and a flattened shard of tin from a biscuit tin lid, and he had bridged the sulking joint with something new. Something flexible enough to forgive the cold a little, generous enough to pass current even when the tight fit loosened under frost. It had been ugly, and it had worked. Thomas cut a small rectangle from a battered oil can and smoothed its edges on a file. He laid the tin on a bit of cloth and pressed his thumb into it to encourage a shallow curve. He slid it beneath a joint like a splint beneath a broken bone. He wrapped the braided copper around the junction and the tin's soft body, then cinched it with lacing cord soaked in rosin. He did it gently, as if binding a wound. He spoke no words, but something in his breath said hold. He brought the cold upon it again. He watched. The needle quivered, dipped, fought, then steadied in a way that felt personal. He did not smile. He moved to the next joint, then the next one, seeking the places where a craftsman in some distant factory had made a perfect piece for a warm room. never imagining the room would be the upper sky, where nothing obeyed. Midnight crawled closer. The hangar had become a chapel of sound, the solitary clink of a tool here, the wind playing the big doors like an instrument there, the regular amen of the generator. Private Andrews returned with a thermos and poured tea into a cup that burnt the tongue and felt like forgiveness. He watched Thomas work and said nothing until silence seemed rude. "What do you call that?" Andrews asked, chin lifting toward the tin, splintered joint. "A kindness," Thomas said. "A way of letting the metal be smaller without breaking faith. Will it hold? It will help. Whether it saves a life? I don't know yet." The admission sat heavy between them, exactly the weight of honesty. Andrews left the thermos and faded back into the shadows of tasks he could finish. Thomas tightened one more wrap, then pressed his fingertips to the joint. The cloth was cool, the tin colder, the copper beneath holding a hint of heat from the friction of his hands. It felt like a small truce, temperature and current agreeing, for now, to stop their quarrel. He replaced the panel and climbed out, shoulders aching with the effort of moving control cables aside in tight channels. He rolled his neck until it popped, and found the ground again with relief. He flicked the master back on, fed current, and watched every little witness light glow, as if they'd been waiting for this exact hour. He took the bench, cold rig away, and the system kept its nerve. He wanted to shout, he didn't. He shut his eyes and let out a slow breath that shook at the end like something finally allowed to weep. The clock over the tool chest said 1:30. He locked the aircraft, stowed the kit, and stepped outside. The tarmac was frost-painted again, glittering beneath a moon that looked like a cracked coin. He walked toward the sleeping barracks with the careful tread of a man who has not decided whether to believe in hope. Sleep came briefly and left without saying goodbye. At first light, thin as paper, he was already on his feet, shaving with cold water that made his skin sting. He kept seeing the needle holding steady in the cold like a heart refusing to slip. He kept seeing his father's hands, steady in the winter barn, making something work not because it was elegant, but because it was faithful. By breakfast, the airfield wore the mask of purpose again. Men moved with a little more speed because they had to. The weather held. Orders went up night run possible. The whisper travelled through the mess like a draft under a door tonight, perhaps. Tonight again. Major Hargreaves found Thomas near the hangar doors, clipboard under his arm, cap shadowing his eyes. Report. "I've reinforced the vulnerable junctions with a flexible bridge," Thomas said, resisting the urge to hide the tin in his pocket like stolen silver. "It compensates for contraction and adds a path that doesn't break when the cold opens a seam. Is it regulation? It's survival." Hargreaves stared long enough to make Thomas feel skinned. Then the major nodded once. "Fit it to 2 ships for a controlled test. I'll authorize fuel for high-altitude circuits this afternoon. If it holds, we'll discuss wider measures." "Sir." The word carried gratitude and a quiet terror. By noon, Thomas and Andrews moved like a two-man machine, hands switching tools without speech, the rhythm of their work honest as a hymn. The air inside the Lancaster was warmer with bodies moving, but the metal kept its own winter. Thomas crawled and wrapped and tied and checked, then double-checked, fingers learning the way by memory. When he banged his elbow on a rib, the pain went white for a moment and snapped away, replaced by the old farm, bred instinct to keep going. Outside, a pilot lit a cigarette with hands that shook, and another crewman laughed too loudly at nothing. Fear showed itself like that here, either too quiet to notice or too loud to ignore. At 3, the first test ship taxied out, its tail swaying a little as if it still remembered grass fields instead of concrete. Thomas stood by the doors with his cap in his hand, the cold biting the sweat that had gathered at his temples. The aircraft turned, lined up, and committed itself to motion. The wheels drew a black line over the frost. And then it was air. He tracked it by ear more than eye at first, a low thunder moving away until it became a humming nail in the distance. He watched the altimeter feed over the portable radio in callouts from the test observer 4000-68. He braced against the moment when 9 would come with the shiver of failure it had adopted as its habit. 9,000. The radio remained calm. 10, 11. The tone of the engine note thinned and went sharper. The observer's voice broke once, as if laughter had cut across it and been quickly suppressed. 15 minutes became 20. Then the call returning to circuit. System steady, no flicker. Thomas swallowed against the sudden heat behind his eyes. He turned away so no one would see what the cold had not put there. The ship made its approach with the languor of something thinking about bed. It landed, the wheels kissed, protested, and agreed. As it taxied in, the observer leaned from the hatch and gave a thumbs up that looked, to Thomas, like a benediction. The second ship followed. And though the sky seemed to hold its breath a little longer this time, perhaps sensing the impudence of men who thought they could teach the cold manners, it too returned with systems still singing. Hargreaves appeared at Thomas's shoulder as if conjured. "Read," he said softly, and there was something in the softness that sounded like respect. "Whatever you did, do it again." Thomas nodded. He could have said that it wasn't perfect. That 10,000 feet in winter over Lincolnshire was not 30,000 feet in the gut of a northern gale. That a thing which survives an afternoon might still betray a man in the blind dark beyond the coast. He said nothing. He went back into the hangar and reached for the tin, the cloth, the copper. He worked until his fingers were wooden things, he ordered by memory rather than feeling. Twilight seeped in. The runway lamps lit like a row of steadfast eyes. The crews moved toward their aircraft with that slow determination that war teaches, without panic, without bravado, carrying their fear like a private, necessary weight. Morgan passed Thomas and touched his shoulder once, and the touch said, "I am trusting you with my life." It said it without a claim. It said it as simply as a man might say goodnight to his wife in a doorway he may never enter again. Thomas watched them go. He heard the engines begin in the order he had learned to count like a liturgy. He felt each vibration in his ribs. He waited for the false start, the cuff. It did not come. The ships rolled. The air took them. The air, which had been an enemy, reached out its hard hands and lifted anyway. He returned to the bench, not because there was anything more to fix in that moment, but because his hands needed something to do that was not praying. He coiled spare wire carefully. He cleaned the tip of the soldering iron that he hadn't dared use because flame can give you confidence and lies at the same time. He wrote in the ledger, "Test bridges hold under 20 minutes at altitude. Flexible path good, contraction compensated. Power stable. Cold smell absent." He closed the book and placed his palm on the cover as if sealing a letter for the future. The generator droned. The wind made a brittle music with the guy wires of the hangar doors. Somewhere far out, beyond the line where land tires of itself and becomes sea, the aircraft crossed into their work. The dark unrolled before them like a command. Hours stretched. The base lived in that strange suspension where it is neither active nor idle, only waiting. Messages crackled and smoothed. The radio officer's shoulders rose and fell in patterns that had nothing to do with breath and everything to do with news. Coffee came and went. Men slept in chairs for 3 minutes and woke with their hearts hammering, faces already turned toward the sound of anything. Near midnight, the first contact returned. A voice, one Thomas recognized. "Base, this is Kestrel 1. Systems steady. We turn for home." Thomas let go of the bench so that he could feel the ground. He did not understand why he had needed that until the voice arrived. He had needed to be sure that the earth would still be there. When something inside him let go, more voices followed, some clipped, some tired, one cheerful in a way that made other men look down. There were losses, yes, because war collects its coins even when men do everything right. But there were no voices telling of a sudden, unreasoning dark. No confessions of instruments dying like candles. No reports of engines that forgot their purpose as if hastily taught. When Morgan's voice finally came, it was quieter than Thomas had known a voice could be, and still be strong. Kestrel 3, homeward. Read, if you're there. Your trick's a good one. Thomas said nothing into the air. He sat down on the cold floor, back against a wheel block, and let the blood return to his hands until it hurt. He imagined the farm for the first time without ache. The low lines of hedges, the smell of wet hay, the click of his father's tongue as he coaxed a stubborn engine into remembering itself. It was the winter of 1941. The cold had settled over Lincolnshire like a punishment from the heavens. Frost coated the airfield in a thin white armour, and the morning fog hung so heavy that the outlines of the hangars looked like ghosts from another age. Engines coughed and sputtered in the distance, echoing through the damp air like the gasps of wounded beasts. Thomas Reed tightened the collar of his oil-stained coat and wiped his hands on a rag that hadn't been clean for weeks. The smell of burnt fuel oil and metal had become part of him, seeping into his clothes, his hair, his thoughts. He had come from a quiet farm in Wiltshire, a place where machines were patient and the ground yielded to care. Now, the machines screamed, and they were dying faster than he could fix them. Every morning began the same way. The sound of engines refusing to start, the clipped voices of officers barking orders, and the soft, defeated sighs of mechanics who had already given everything. The airfield was a graveyard of effort. Rows of bombers lined up like sleeping giants, their wings shrouded in ice, their bellies still blackened from the night raids. Thomas walked between them, his breath fogging the air. He carried his toolkit like a soldier carries a rifle. Inside were tools worn smooth by calloused hands, spanners, pliers, screwdrivers, but nothing that could fix what was truly wrong. The men called it the curse of the circuit, a problem buried deep inside the electrical systems of the bombers. At high altitude, under the freezing weight of 10,000 feet, the current faltered. Lights dimmed, engines sputtered, and sometimes they simply fell from the sky. No one could explain it. Not the engineers in London, not the officers who drew diagrams in heated rooms far from the front. Out here, it was guesswork and desperation. Thomas crouched beside the open nose of a Lancaster, its skin peeled back to reveal veins of copper and steel. He traced the wires with his fingers, feeling the stiffness of frost. Somewhere in this mess of cables, a flaw was hiding, a weakness that only revealed itself in the cruelest conditions. Read. The voice of Sergeant Callow cut through the morning air. We've lost another one last night, no enemy fire. Just dead in the clouds. You'll find the report on my desk. Thomas didn't answer. He didn't have to. He already knew what it meant. Another crew gone. Another machine swallowed by the sky. He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, its pages stiff with grease. Every night he wrote in it. Notes, sketches, bits of thought that might someday make sense. He flipped it open and stared at yesterday's page. Voltage drop under cold strain. Altitude interference. Moisture, grounding error. The questions mocked him now. As the day grew older, the fog lifted enough to reveal the runway, a stretch of cracked concrete running into a horizon of grey. A bomber taxied slowly past him, its engines rumbling unevenly, coughing blue smoke. Men waved it forward, their faces tight with exhaustion. There was no time to rest. Every hour mattered. Every mission delayed meant another city burned somewhere else. Inside the hangar, the sound of hammers and shouting filled the air. Sparks showered from welding torches, bouncing like fireflies against the damp floor. Thomas moved through the chaos quietly, setting his tools on a bench cluttered with half-torn schematics. Private Andrews approached, a young man with eyes too old for his face. They're saying command might ground the squadron, he muttered, glancing around. Too many losses. Too many unexplained things. Thomas looked up. They can't ground them, he said softly. Grounded planes don't win wars. Andrews hesitated. And falling ones don't either. The truth hung between them. Outside, a gust of wind blew through the hangar doors, scattering papers across the floor. One of them caught Thomas's boot. A maintenance log from the previous night. He bent to pick it up. The entry was scrawled in a pilot's handwriting. Lights flickered at 9,000. Left engine lost charge. Systems dead, no recovery. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Every detail mattered now. Hours passed in a haze of effort. Tools clanged, curses filled the air, and one by one, the engines roared back to life, only to falter minutes later. The sun dipped low, turning the sky the color of rusted copper. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow, even though the air was freezing. The frustration was suffocating. By evening, the mess hall was a quiet tomb. Men sat hunched over tin trays, eating without words. The clatter of cutlery sounded like rain. Thomas sat alone near the far wall, staring into his stew. His hands shook from exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. He thought of home, the gentle hum of the farm's generator, the warmth of the barn when his father tinkered with old radios and engines. He remembered the way his father used to say, "Machines aren't stubborn, Tom. They just need to be understood." But here, understanding seemed impossible. These machines were different, angrier, more fragile. Later that night, he found himself back in the hangar, long after the others had gone to their bunks. The moonlight spilled through the high windows, painting the metal wings in silver. He moved among them like a ghost, his footsteps echoing softly. He stopped by the same Lancaster he'd worked on that morning and rested a hand on its cold skin. "Why won't you hold?" he whispered. He traced a line along the circuit housing, then opened it again. Inside, the wires looked perfect. But he knew better. He imagined the cold of altitude, the kind that froze a man's breath solid. Maybe the metal contracted. Maybe moisture inside turned to ice. Breaking connections too fine to see. He took a small piece of copper wire from his pocket and turned it between his fingers. The warmth of his hand softened it slightly. Something about that motion felt familiar. He remembered his father's workshop again. A broken tractor, a frozen circuit. A makeshift repair using wire and tin to redirect current. It had worked. Crude, but it had worked. The thought was faint, fragile. Not yet a solution, just a whisper from the past. But it stayed with him. He looked out across the hangar. Rows of silent planes, each waiting for dawn, each carrying the same floor, and he felt the weight of every life those wings would hold. The next morning came with no mercy. Rain this time, not frost. Cold, steady, relentless. The hangar roofs dripped like sieves. Thomas worked through it all, sleeves rolled up, water running down his arms. The officers grew impatient. Reports piled higher. Command demanded progress. Major Hargreaves appeared by noon, his uniform spotless despite the mud. "Read," he barked. "London's breathing down my neck. We've lost 6 aircraft in 8 days. 6. What's the problem?" Thomas straightened slowly, rain dripping from his chin. "Sir, it's electrical. The systems can't handle the cold at altitude. Something in the current fails when. Something." The major's voice cut sharp. "Find the something, or you'll be off this base by week's end." The words stung not for the threat, but for the futility behind them. The major didn't understand. None of them did. They wanted miracles from scraps. When the officer left, Thomas slammed a wrench onto the bench. The clang echoed through the hangar. Andrews looked up from across the room but said nothing. Everyone was too tired for sympathy. As daylight faded, Thomas leaned over the schematic again, tracing every line with his eyes, memorizing the paths of current and voltage. He felt like a man staring at a map of his own failure. But somewhere, beneath the frustration, that memory from the farm still flickered. A faint glimmer of possibility. By nightfall, the rain had stopped. The airfield was silent except for the distant hum of the generator. Thomas stepped outside, staring up at the cloud-covered sky. Somewhere up there, men were dying because of a fault buried in copper. Somewhere up there, the problem waited to be solved. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he would not stop until he found it. Because in the quiet between the wind and the rain, he could almost hear his father's voice again. Steady, calm, unshaken. Machines aren't stubborn, Tom. They just need to be understood. and beneath that whisper a single idea began to form. A small, fragile spark. But sparks, he knew, were where all fires begin. The next dawn opened with a thin wash of pale light, and the quiet throb of a generator that sounded more tired than any man on the base. The fog had lifted just enough to see the hedgerows beyond the perimeter wire and the black carcasses of deflated barrage balloons sagging against the sky.